Yeah, so I gather from your introductions that some of you probably know a lot about butterflies and can identify most species. So this is just a very brief introduction, really, for those of you that are not so familiar with them. I think what I would say is that when you set up a transect or start monitoring, it's good to start somewhere which is perhaps not so rich in butterflies, because we're quite interested in how common species are doing as well as rare ones. And so one of the key things is to try and start monitoring near to where you live, because then it's much easier to do the counting. So we're interested in rare species as well, but that's where using the app can be helpful, because you can do some timed counts somewhere high up in the mountains. But we're interested also in common species. So if you set up a transect, it's often good to have it near to where you live. So it's quite easy to go and record every week or every other week. Anyway, so I'm going to just give you a quick introduction to the world of butterflies, and apologies for those of you that know all this. So, of course, people in most countries distinguish between the butterflies, the day-flying beautiful butterflies, and the moths, which are also beautiful and very colourful, but most of them fly at night. So some countries don't distinguish between these two, but others do. So you've got lots of colourful butterflies and moths, and these are some which include a lot of moths which look just as beautiful as butterflies, and some butterflies are not so beautiful or not so colourful. And so in this particular picture, the one on the top left is the only butterfly there. It's a skipper, which they tend to be brown and rather dull colouring, whereas these moths are very beautiful. So obviously one of the things you have to think about is how you distinguish butterflies and moths. And the main method is just that butterflies, their Latin name means clubbed antenna, and so they have this very obvious club at the end of their antenna. All the other shapes in this diagram are moths, and you see some moths have a sort of swollen end to the antenna, which makes it very confusing. But if they've got a definite club, it's a butterfly. A lot of moths have these very beautiful feathered antennae, so you can really tell those apart. So that's kind of one thing that you have to think about, because there are some very pretty day-flying moths, which obviously won't be in a butterfly guide, but maybe when we have a look at this guide to the common species of Slovakia, we'll include some of the common day-flying moths as well, because we're quite interested in recording those as well. I'm just so yeah, so the butterflies like this one here, they often sit with their wings open in the sunshine anyway, and they have these very obvious clubbed antennae. This beautiful moth obviously has feathered antennae, so you know that it's a moth, and their wings often don't open quite as much as a butterfly when you see them. So basically the first thing to do is, particularly if you can take a photo, is to check the antenna, and if they're clubbed antenna, then obviously it'll be in the butterfly books. But if they're not, like this one here, which has like a filamentous antenna, that's a moth. So identifying butterflies, so this is just to say a very crash course, just to get you thinking about how to do it. It's starting off with just the common species is relatively straightforward. There are some species that look very similar, and there you'll need a closer look or a good photo, and then look in an identification guide to be sure. But as Christina said, if you're in any doubt, you can always post these things on the internet, and there's a lot of apps. So like the iNaturalist website, if you put a photo on it, it'll suggest what that photo might be. But if you post, you know, maybe we'll set up a group, and if you post pictures, then people can identify them. So one thing that happens, which is confusing, is that sometimes the male butterfly is different from the female butterfly. So in this case, Anthocharis cadaminae, which is flying at the moment. It's a lovely spring butterfly. In Britain, we call this the orange tip, of obvious reasons, but the female doesn't have the orange tip, and she looks like some of the other whites, but she has this beautiful hind wing, which the others don't have. And some of the blues have a blue male and a brown female. So again, if you're looking at the male, they tend to be a bit easier to identify, whereas the females, or the brown ones, are a bit more tricky to tell apart. So as I said, if in doubt, catch it if you've got a net, or take a photo and then share the pictures on a platform, and somebody will identify it for you. There's a lot of people out there who are very pleased to identify butterflies, either on Twitter. I do a lot on Twitter, and people post butterflies, and I post moths as well, and people identify them. So one thing to start off with butterflies, and I guess the chart that Christina will produce will separate out the butterfly families, because they tend to look rather similar. So all the ones in the Hesperiidae, the skippers, tend to look rather similar. They're small, brown or orange, and so they're different from, for example, the Papilionidae, which are the swallowtails, which are big, showy butterflies. Pieridae are whites, and so on. So I'm just going to start off by a quick run through some of these families to give you an idea of what types of butterflies look like. So to begin with, the Hesperiidae, which are more moth-like than perhaps some of the other butterflies. They're very small, most of them. They're brown or orangey coloured, and they have usually quite stocky bodies, and they're very fast flying. So actually taking photographs of them is not so easy often. They tend to stick to the ground mainly, so they're often found in grasslands, and they scoot around on the grass, and you have to have a good eyesight to kind of follow them and watch them land, but they often don't fly very far before they land, so that gives you a chance to have a good look. So this is some examples of the skippers, the Hesperiidae. You get one or two which are very brightly coloured, like this one, Carterocephalus palaemon, and then you get a lot of them which look like this, which are small black and white checkered butterflies, which are in this family, and then there's some orange coloured skippers, which we call the golden skippers, which again have different ways of identifying them. So these are all in the same family. And just to give you an example, this is sort of to give you, so you have to sometimes look quite closely, because there are two different species shown here, and you have to look quite closely at the spotting in the wingtips before you can really identify them. But actually in this particular case, the hind wings look completely different. So sometimes you need to look at both the hind wing and the upper side. So here, if you look at the hind wing, you can see here that there are two different species. There's this species here, which have got no silver spots, and there's this one which has, this is Hesperia comma. So getting a shot of the, or a look at the underside often helps. So yeah, that just summarizes the fact that it's good to look at the upper side as well as the underside. And then, as I said, this group here, which for most people, when they start monitoring butterflies, these are the most difficult ones. But actually what it's good to remember is that on most sites that you go to, there'll only be one or two of these species on there. So you won't need to separate out all the different Pieridae species, because they are quite difficult. So again, taking photos, putting them online is probably the way to go. But once you get to know a site and you start recording every week, you soon work out which one's present and which ones aren't. Then moving to some more easy groups, the Papilionidae, which are the swallowtails. So these are big, beautiful butterflies. often very showy and conspicuous, often come to flowers and can be photographed and identified much more easily. So here's some of the swallowtails with these beautiful tails, but these other butterflies are in the same family. And the whites, well, there's quite a lot of whites in Europe, and some of them are quite tricky to identify, but also in this family are this butterfly that we showed earlier on, Nymphalidae cardaminae, and also the yellows, the things like the clouded yellow Coleus species. So it's good just to think that all this group of butterflies are in the same family, the whites and the yellows, we call them. And there's just some of the Latin names coming up. So yes, again, just reiterating that in this group there, the whites, there's this group, which is the Leptidae species, which are one of the few groups that is almost impossible to identify, to separate from a picture, because there's 2 or 3 species which look pretty much identical, and we tend to lump these together as Leptidae species group, because they're so difficult to tell apart in the field. And the Coleus species, there's 1 or 2 very common ones that you'll get familiar with. So just an example, so here's 2 very, very common butterflies. This is the Pieridae brassicae and Pieridae rapi and Pieridae napi. So these are the 3 common whites that you'll see. The brassicae is the biggest, has big black margins. Rapi has smaller black tips, and napi has these very prominent green veins on the hind wing. So again, if you get a good look, you'll soon get the hang of identifying these. So things to look for: underside, whether it's got the veins, also whether it's got a big black mark in the wingtip. And then this butterfly here, which you'll get in Slovakia, it's Pieridae mannii, which is spread enormously through Europe. One of the reasons why butterflies are such good indicators is that they can react very quickly. And this one is spread, used to be only in the Mediterranean, and is now right the way up to the Netherlands. So it's spread right the way through Europe in the last 20 years, has a very big black spot in the forewing. Some other species you just need to look out for on these whites, which are these Pontia species, which have this rather dappled looking underside, green and white, obviously to camouflage themselves when they're at rest. And this one, which we saw earlier, the Nymphalidae cardaminae, which has this beautiful mottling. So there's some tips here, like this one is supposed to look like a Mickey Mouse kind of figure on the hind wing, which differentiates it from the others. So moving on, this family, the Lycaenidae, are very small butterflies. Again, they tend to stick close to the ground, but they include some of these butterflies called the hair streaks, which have these tiny little tails on the wing. They have rapid flights, but they tend to stick close to the ground or around shrubs. So in the families, there's this group here, which are the coppers. So these are some of the most beautiful butterflies, which have got these iridescent coppery wings. This group here, the Theclinae, are the hair streaks, which have these tiny little tails to the wings. Incidentally, these are actually false heads. So the idea is that a bird thinks this is the head, and if it attacks the butterfly, it hits this end, which is expendable because the real head is up here. And apparently this works, and you can quite often see these butterflies with chunks out of their wing. And then the blue butterflies, which have these lovely spots on the hind wing, and there's quite a few species which, again, are a little bit difficult to identify, but with practice can be identified. So one thing, just a good thing to when you start off is that this butterfly here, Polyomytus icarus, which is a very common and widespread butterfly right throughout Europe, has a spot here. It's called the Icarus spot, and a lot of the other butterflies in this family don't have it. So again, if you get a good shot of the underside, then you can soon tell these apart. And then here's another copper butterfly, Lycaenidae, and again some hair streaks which have got the tiny little tails. And then moving on to the Nymphalidae, which is a big group of butterflies. It's about half the butterflies fall into this group, and they vary a lot from being these bright orange ones, which are very conspicuous, very common butterflies like this one, the peacock Aglaeus io, Inaceus io, sorry. And then there's also some of the browns as well in this family. So it's a big group with quite a lot of different color forms. This one's the most curious one of them because it has a very obvious, what we call a snout, or these are palps, look like false antennae sticking out the front of it, Libethia celtis. So it's a unique butterfly to Europe, but quite widespread. And then just to give you some idea of these types of butterflies, the color forms, some of them have these sculptured wings edges like these two. These means that they overwinter as adult butterflies with the sculpted edges which make them look like leaves. And then these ones, the fritillaries, which have these checkerboard patternings which you can get to grips with if you have a good book. And butterflies like this Meletea kinxia, for example, you look at this row of dots and that identifies it. But bear in mind that if you go, for example, to a site in May, probably only one or two of these species will be flying at that time of year, and you'll get to know that this butterfly materna only flies in June, so you won't see it in May. It doesn't hatch until June and then flies into July and then disappears again. Whereas this butterfly kinxia tends to fly in May, and then you don't see it again until it has its second brood in August. So you'll soon get to know that the time of year different species come out. Also in this group of Nymphalidae is a family called the Satyridae, which are the browns. Also have this butterfly here called the Melanagia galathea. There's a couple of species that you might get in Slovakia, but otherwise they're brown butterflies. They're relatively inconspicuous, but they often sit still or sit on flowers for a long period, so you can usually get a good view of them or photograph. And again, just to show you that for example, one of the things you have to look at with these species is the spotting on the hind wing. And here there are two different species, one with spots and one without spots. And so you just get used to what bits of the butterfly to look at to identify it. And here's the two different species, both which you'll get in Slovakia. This one, Nymphalidae, which has these very big row of spots on the hind wing, and this one, Pamphilus, which doesn't. So just a quick roundup of these different butterfly species. There's the Hesperiidae, the skippers, which are small and fast, big showy Papilionidae, the whites and the yellows. There's this group which has only got the one representative in Europe. The Lycaenidae, which are the blues and the coppers, and the Nymphalidae, which is a very big group, which includes some of these very common species. So as Christina said, there's some good guides to butterflies of the whole of Europe. But of course, that has a lot of butterflies you won't see in Slovakia. So that's where I think producing a guide or using the app where it will automatically select the species that occur in Slovakia, that would help. There is a downloadable guide from the Butterfly Conservation Europe website, which shows you how to separate out the more difficult species. And there's several websites that with lots of galleries of pictures. So if you get into this and you want to really start getting to grips with identification, then these are the places to go. But I usually find the easiest thing is to put it on Facebook or Twitter, and somebody will identify it for you, and that's how you learn. Yeah, so here's some of the Facebook groups. And I gather you've got a Facebook group already in Slovakia, so that may be the way to go and to start, those of you that don't know your butterflies, to identify them. So thank you very much for listening. That's a very quick rush through. It sounds daunting at first, but actually, as I said to you, most places you go to will only have 40 or 50 different butterfly species, so it's not so difficult. If you go up into the mountains, into rich meadows, then you might get up to 100 species, so that's when it gets a bit trickier. But to begin with, if you look in most places, you'll only see a smaller number, and you'll soon get to grips with the common species. And then the difficult ones, you'll need to start taking photos or really looking in ID guides to separate them. But it's all doable. People do it right across Europe. And of course, one of the great things is that it's a fabulous learning experience, and raises your skill level and gives you a great interest, and people go on then to share that interest with other people. So it's a lovely hobby to have. And of course, a lot of these butterflies that you see occur just in towns and cities as well, so you don't have to go so far to see them. Okay, so that's me for that presentation.